Well, thank you for that great introduction. I'm an economist. Please don't hold that against me here. It's always been a dream of mine to be in a room with scientists, and now I can pretend to be a scientist, even though I don't play one on TV. But to give you a kind of a background on Prop 65 and me, I came into the state at Cal Poly in 1988. I'd been in Washington, D.C., and I grew up in that area. So I come in 88, and I started seeing these signs. And I just kind of ignored them. Now, we go up to about 2012, and I was asked, well, what would a cost-benefit analysis of Prop 65 look like? And I looked at this person and went, and I think she figured out that I didn't know what it was. And I didn't. And then she, oh, those signs. I go, oh. And I go, well, okay. Said, well, you do cost-benefit analysis, right? And I go, sure, sort of. And I'm always wondering, what is this going to entail? And then I started doing a literature check. And back in '86, when it was passed, there was a flurry of articles, mostly in law journals. Only a handful, just 2 or 3 economists did anything on this. And it was mostly based on the law. And it was such a kind of revolutionary law that was passed by a proposition, which also means that there was no basis of a scientific inquiry into the policy. It was just passed by voters. And then I started looking around 5 years ago into the literature, and something was very striking. And what was so striking was that there was no empirical test of this. You would think the proponents would have been just publishing article after article after article after article showing how wonderful this is. Now, that doesn't mean it's not wonderful, but it makes me a little suspicious here. And then I started to ask myself, well, what would I do? And today I'm going to talk about 2 different strands of thinking about how do I even get at the benefits, and then talk about the costs. So with that, let me just give a very brief introduction to what this proposition is. So in '86 it comes about. Voter approved by 64%, the long version of Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act. It's a right-to-know law. So businesses must inform, warn, if you will, if there are these toxic chemicals in the products within California. And there's a list that's published, close to 800 or so. It's interesting on the site, they don't say how many, so you have to go back and add them up in a spreadsheet or something every time. So what do you have to warn on? Well, safe harbor type of warning is, given the proposition's wording, it has to be clear and reasonable warnings on products carrying a lifetime cancer risk or reproductive harm. So in effect, what that is a 1 out of 100,000 chance of any person exposed to the product contracting cancer over 70 years. So that's the bar. So you might be going, well, is that a pretty high bar or a low bar? I think you know what that bar would be. So I'll talk a little bit about that in just a while. So where do you warn? Well, labels, signs, notices, newspapers. The house that I bought in 1989 had one while it was being built. My wife and I going through that and go, what? Should we even go in the house? So here on the lower right is kind of the generic warning that one would see. Okay. I remember when I started thinking about this, I was going into a place that was selling coffee, and it had a large number of different coffees, and they had one sign, and I was wondering, is that all the coffees, or is it just the one right below it? Give you a little more idea. On the left, last summer I was in San Francisco at a fairly famous department store, and this is a warning on the left about the tableware or silverware or the dinnerware. On the right, I got this recently because I got some, those things they used to call checks. And so every now and then you got to write a paper check. So I ordered it, and they said, "Do you want a free check cover?" And I went, "Sure," because mine is from 25 years ago. And I got this little sheet of paper in it that says, "Warning, this checkbook has these things." So this just gives you kind of an idea of if you're not in California much. So the enforcement of this, it's not by any government agency. The California Attorney General can do it through an enforcement action, rarely done. District city attorneys with cities greater than 750,000 people, rarely done. Usually it's a party acting in the so-called public interest. They can file lawsuits against businesses for failure to post these warnings. Okay. The penalties are up to $2,500 per day for each violation. The party in the public interest first sends an alleged violation notice 60 days prior to filing suit. In 2015, there were 582 settlements costing $26 million, of which 68% went to attorney fees. We'll talk more about near the end, give you the last 5 years or so of these numbers. So what's the theory? So the theory is, under the conventional view of economists, and this is economists of this ilk have been beat up a lot lately because we assume that people are rational. Well, I am that type of economist who tend to think that people are rational given the information that they have. That doesn't mean, though, that they have all the information that is available on product attributes. So there's also a market for giving information to consumers, and as evidence for this, we see lawsuits, and we also see stock price reactions to adverse events. So while a seller might want to go and hide everything, we believe that markets do have an incentive to inform, but the markets are imperfect, and they tend to underprovide information. One is a so-called public good problem, that if my company goes and does a bunch of research and announces it, that others can free ride upon that also sell similar products. So there's an underprovision of information. Under this view, labels will inform utility maximizing rational consumers, able to learn. This is the traditional approach. Now, since working on this in my initial draft, or back in 2012, 2013, I started revisiting this because of my research on food labeling and government's dietary advice, and also thinking through other things such as should GMO issues be placed out front and center. So this is called Behavioral Economics view. So this has been sweeping through the social sciences about, consumers aren't rational under this view, and they make harmful decisions. They hurt themselves. Not on purpose, they can't help it. So overeating, smoking, there's a whole long list due to self-control problems and problems in cognitive power, if you will. All these biases. Some very famous books, and goes back to research that started around 30 years ago, intersection of psychology and economics and law. So many of these decisions that consumers make under this view are unconscious. And in fact, one of the very famous behavioral economists who's in the marketing field coined the term mindless eating. That there are a lot of people that just have this set, that they don't know what they're doing, they're just kind of mindlessly on remote control, their automatic control. So one of the approaches here to deal with this irrational nature of consumers is to nudge them. And there's a very famous book on nudging by Rosen and Sunstein, and you've probably heard about it all. And this is really another way of looking at Prop 65, is that you're trying to nudge people in some sense to inform them. But this is a very different view of what a consumer would look like. So nudges are trying to make the somewhat mindless into be more mindful. So if you have that view, which is kind of the reigning view on warning labels or informational labels, this view also tends to place a whole lot of blame on sellers. Sellers, food products, sellers of checkbook covers, silverware. And here's a very, I think, choice quote from Thaler and Sunstein. The key point here is that for all their virtue, markets often give companies a strong incentive to cater to and profit from human frailties rather than to try to eradicate them or to minimize their efforts. So if you have this point of view, you can see that nudging might be a very powerful intervention in their mind. So I'm now, and this is the kind of the second round of me working on Prop 65, is thinking of it in the nudge framework, because the rational consumer framework is quite different. And why would we then want mandated nudges through disclosure laws? So Cass Sunstein, in his book The Simpler, says, well, one is that we could promote sunlight on problems to both help producers and consumers take actions. So that, for example, consumers, if we start doing food labels, highlighting calories or energy intake, whatever, that they'll start thinking, well, maybe there is a weight problem. Maybe I should start thinking about it. But also then to spur producers to action, because now it's going to be highlighted and producers are going to be given a nudge, if you will, themselves, because going back to the this quote up here, if you place a lot of blame on the sellers, you want to change the sellers. And you treat the sellers as rational in their mind, I suppose, and consumers as irrational. Number two, they provide information citizens can easily find and use. So this would be also very consistent with the conventional view of rational consumers, just give them more information. And number three, it could improve government decision making, because most of these regulations or nudges, mandated nudges, have to go through public input. So this is the description by Cass Sunstein as why, yes, in effect, more labels, warnings, probably the better. So what we'll do is to improve the consumers. Okay, so this is front and center, one of the things that Cass Sunstein applauds. Here is, as you all know, the NFP, and what it does is attempt to inform, and you can think of these three nudge goals as, why would I want to do that? Okay, so this model that I'm going to now present, a probability model, can be used toward anything. You know, the upper left on drinking beverages and sugar, the GMO one, the warning fumigation in progress, and I only put this one in because 1 week ago my house was fumigated for termites, and there were signs. And I almost brought that sign in, but then I don't really need to show that one. But, or consumers have a right to know where their clothing's coming from, country of origin labeling, or the salt issue, or EPA mileage ratings, other ones, meat, and then on cigarettes. And I was thinking, you know, a really interesting paper would be the plain wrapping advertising on cigarettes packages, because that's sort of a right to know kind of in reverse. You're not telling them anything other than a warning, not anything about the product itself other than be careful. So now, how do I think about this in a probabilistic sense? And this was not how I did my first work on this. Now I'm trying to think, how would I apply this to any type of nudge? So if we're going to nudge health gains through labeling, it's really simply presented as a four-part model. Number one, consumers will read label. What's the probability? Number two, they'll understand the labels. Number three, they will make changes that are consistent with what the nudger wants them to do. And number 4, and this is the one that I had spent the most time on, and see that this is where we really need to be advancing in the social sciences with marriage with science. Even if you go through the first 3, will you get the 4th? Rather than, oh, I just know somehow it will magically happen. So if we think about this as a joint probability model, and this is a very, very simple case. I'm pretty convinced, I'm not a statistician, though I do a lot of econometrics. I would think that if you get an even fancier model, it's going to make it even more difficult to think through how would you devise effective labels. All right, so the joint probability is using the chain rule, this mess, where you have the probability of the first and then the probability of the second given the first, probability of the third given the first 2, etc. So just to give you an idea, and just a simulation, I'll start out with an optimistic case. That each of those probabilities are 50%, okay? So, I mean, even on the last one, so that would mean the probability of successfully nudging improved health through this label is about 6.25%. And that's not even, I mean, how would you even measure the improved health here? So let me take just, and I'm not claiming these are the correct numbers, but I'm also going to claim Prop 65, nobody ever thought of this. And on the food labeling, I think you know the answer. Less optimistic, I'll assume 10%, which maybe is still might be charitable, I'm not sure. If you plug it all through, the percent is 0.01% that this will work. So how many of you want to bet on that? So I didn't do this the first time. I did it more like an econometric model, which I'm going to show you very quickly in just a second. So let me go through these steps. So number 1, a percentage of consumers notice labels. So there was an article written years ago about a typical California hotel. What would have to have this Prop 65 warning? And here's a list, and I don't even have them all. Quite a few, I would say. Now, no one's done a study on do consumers notice Prop 65 labels. I mean, I've looked. Maybe someone has it, but I haven't looked. So our best research comes from food labeling, at least that I know of. So we do know that if you're going to grab consumer attention, you've got to inform them on something that they actually care about. And while 65% were looking at food labels in the 90s, it dropped to about 48% in 2013. And research also suggests that these self-reported numbers are overstatements. Also, nudges inform about calories and fat with these food labels, but it's taste that really matters. So a nudger can go, but you need to know about calories and fat and sugar. And the consumer goes, does it taste good? Well, what would they do? Well, this is another paper. Because in effect, if you really want to change behavior, maybe you need to make products taste worse, right? But I've never seen a nudger go there yet. Maybe that's the next step. Maybe I'm giving too much help here. So Prop 65, there's this ubiquitous nature of warnings. They're going to foster relatively little notice over time, and you're going to get over-warning at times. Because who wants a lawsuit or the bad publicity? And even if you have a minute amount of this chemical, why not just post a sign? It clears you of any any problems whatsoever. So step one, percentage of consumers notice labels, certainly not 100%. Number two step, a percentage of the consumers reading labels actually understand them. Consumers, we know, struggle to understand these food labels, often being overwhelmed. A recent study suggested that 52% of consumers think that doing their taxes are easier than figuring out what is healthy eating. And this is something else that we do find, is that the consumers, when they see food labels, they get better at estimating calories. But it doesn't translate into changing their behavior. But they get really much better. It's just like if you give everybody a scale that they have to stand on every day, they'll probably know their weight better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they will lose weight. Maybe some people, I mean, I'm just generalizing here. So 99% or 90% have given some thought to food ingredients, but taste, again, dominates choices. Then price, which to an economist I'm going, of course, it's called the law of demand. And here's the issue: the lower the price, the higher the quantity of the product you want. And then the third is healthiness, whatever that means. And that's why I have it in quotes. Do they understand? Well, 64% of consumers used the serving size information in 2008, but apparently at least half didn't know what it really meant. And they have this confusion, in which I'm sure many in this room know, about portion size and serving size, and I did a little research on it before coming here today, and I don't want a multiple choice test on that one. But I sort of get the gist. We also know that consumers tend to overestimate small probability risks and underestimate larger risks. You're much more concerned about a shark attack, for example, than doing something that has a much higher probability risk to your. The Tylenol case that, if you remember back, if you're old as me, in the 1980s, I mean, the news all over the place. It was a small probability risk, obviously extremely unfortunate, devastated sales, but it was a low probability risk. So you've got to be thinking about, well, what was that lifetime cancer risk issue that we were, as the bar? So what does Prop 65 do? Well, it informs that a product has a chemical that might cause cancer or affect reproduction. There's no information currently on what the substance is, where it is in the product, how the consumer might be exposed, what level of risk it is, or how would you reduce your exposure other than, I suppose, running from the store? And I'm not even sure if that's the case. So what does this warning really do? So remember, this is this step 2 in this chain of events, to think about, am I really going to improve public health here through these warning labels? So there has been a revision of the 1986 law. So now, as of August 30th, 2018, the safe harbor warning has to have at least one listed chemical by name contained in the product, and then go to the website here to inform yourself a little more. And I didn't go there, and I'm not sure how many people would go there, or even if they did go there, if they would understand it. This is what I like to say in public policy about the waiting for Godot type of moment about reform. That you just keep waiting and waiting and waiting, and there's a 1986 law. So we get, well, in 2018, we made a change. Now ask yourself, is that change that substantial? Might be a step in the right direction, or not. Step 3, a percentage of the consumers reading and understanding the labels actually make healthier choices. Well, the biggest literature we have right now are like calorie requirements, labels, warnings, or whatever, and restaurants and bars. Nutrition fact panel has had no effect on total fat, saturated fat, or cholesterol, according to some studies. Maybe it's had it on an individual, but if we look at a population effect. The New York City 2008 on chain restaurants, Posting calories hasn't affected the level of calories consumed. Similar result for King County, Washington. There's a long list and meta-studies that over and over are saying, yeah, consumers get better at estimating calories, but they don't change their consumption by very much. Now, a nudger might go, yeah, it's because the nudge isn't hard enough, or we got to put a tax on, or a ban, or we got to make the food taste worse, or whatever. But here's the evidence so far. Maybe altering the label will have an effect, but could also be unintended. So Prop 65, I don't see a whole lot of evidence here that we have a very high probability on this step 3 in the chain of events. Step 4, a percentage of consumers who read and understand labels who then alter purchases experience improved health. It actually works toward what we really are interested in doing. Okay. Well, here is where I've been spending a lot of my time recently, and that is I went back and looked at all of the, and there are many, many experimental studies trying to show how nudges improve wealth, health, and happiness, to quote the original Nudge book. But they stop short of, here's a nudge to try to have you drink less soda or fewer hamburgers or whatever it might be. And if they have some success, they say, we won. And as an economist, I'm going, well, how did they substitute? So if you make this product less desirable to them somehow, they're going to alter their purchases somewhere else, and they may actually have a less healthful conclusion. But it's never about, well, did they lose weight over 20 years or 10 years or 5 years? Do they have, what's their diabetes risk? Whatever it is that you're trying to target. So there's a huge problem here. So the effects on disease, weight, and other health measures are just rarely examined. It's kind of like, well, we just know that it would work. We just know that the label will magically work. And if you were to pose to them, all right, let's go to the 4 steps here in this model. You jumped from 1 to 4 without any evidence. I want to believe 2. Show me. What evidence are you showing that this actually works the way that you think? So the assessment of the performance of the intervention needs major redirection. And I do blame social scientists for a lot of this, is that they think they're scientists, I guess, and that just because they come along, and I know that I could say something else there, but anyway, it's just my good intention works. I just know it does. And I've talked to nudgers that go, well, and I say, what makes you an expert in any of this? They go, well, look at my weight. Or they go, well, somebody has to do it. And as interestingly, in the obesity front, social scientists are on the very low end on weight. They tend to be much below the average. So I guess we are experts. Now, how does Prop 65 work through this? So I just went through the probability model. This is my new work. This is the older work where I went, okay, what would I do to try to examine, did Prop 65 work? Did it lower cancer incidence or affect reproductive harm? Well, as it turns out, I can get some data on a cancer incidence, nothing on reproductive harm. So unfortunately, I just focused on cancer incidence. And here's the question. Prop 65 comes into California, no other state. Was there a drop in California relative to other states that didn't have that right to know law? So I looked in the SEER 9 registries, and I picked out the 4 large cities, Atlanta, Detroit, San Francisco, Oakland, and Seattle, Puget Sound, and I just did a regression framework and just asked, is there a significant effect here? Measuring this cancer incidence, number of 100,000 people at risk, age-adjusted rates, So it's just a very, crude process, but I don't know, why wouldn't anybody have ever done this before? And going back to the beginning of the paper. So there's going to be a lagged effect from Prop 65. I mean, this would be truly magic if we just passed that law and we have a huge drop in cancer incidence. That would be wonderful. So the latency period associated with these toxic chemicals influenced by many things: amount and frequency of exposure, age, genetics, lifestyle, independent of right-to-know law. And don't yell at me, I'm not a scientist. I'm going to look at some of this work and go, what do the so-called experts tell me? And looking at the American Cancer Society, the site down there, they say, well, environmental substance exposure is associated with about 2 to 15% of all cancers. So here's the issue. We know that Prop 65 can't be the only thing that affects cancer incidence. So how do we deal with that? And we do this by a control model. So I'm going to compare the gap between the San Francisco, and I couldn't get data on California, unfortunately. So I've got San Francisco, Oakland, and the dotted line is the introduction of the law. And I looked at all gender, I looked at male, and I looked at female, and all race. And just as an eyeball armchair empiricizing, you go, oh, okay. And when I was showing this to my colleagues who are actually much better at econometrics than me, said, you don't even need to do a test. I said, well, no, I do. I will. Because maybe these are levels, these are not gaps. Okay, so we can see there is San Francisco in the dark line. This is male, all race. And here is female, all race. So, there's a difference, as one should suspect. So the empirical strategy is that I don't know what the lag should be. So I don't want to be accused of cherry-picking data either. So I'm just going to try, about any lag I have, and ask, is there a consistent story? So I'm going to start with a 10-year lag and go out to 19 years given the data set that I had. The shortest lag starts in 96. So I'm going to give Prop 65 at least to 1996, from 86 to have some effect. And then I carry it out to 2005. I want to see, is there a consistent story? I'm going to examine the incidence gap with San Francisco to control for these other factors that affect cancer incidence. And by doing that, all these other things such as lifestyle, healthcare, cancer detection, air, water pollution are going on all across the country. So in effect, by taking this gap between San Francisco and these other cities, I'm controlling for those. Okay. And it's a model, so it's imperfect, but show me a better model. Number 3, I'm just going to use a simple dichotomous variable for Prop 65. It's a 0-1. So a positive coefficient would say there's a larger gap consistent that Prop 65 worked to lower cancer incidence. So without boring you with all the econometrics, and I have 9 tables of these, but I don't want to go through these because the story is consistent. There's very little to no effect. So on the red here in 2000, Prop 65, and it's a fairly weak significance level of 0.02. But in 2001, 2003, etc., no effect. Basically, Prop 65 isn't showing anything consistent. Here is in 1997 for both sexes, Detroit, San Francisco gap. But it happened in 97 at an even lower level of significance of 0.03, and then it vanishes. And then finally, the only other table I'm going to show you is Seattle, San Francisco. And once again, this is even a weaker significance of 0.04 in 1999, and then in 2000 vanishes. Okay, so I did many different econometric attempts to just bend over backwards, if you will. If there's an effect, let me find it. And I don't want to cherry pick. I could have, published just 1999 there. Go, see, I got a significant effect. So summarizing the empirical tests. Just eyeballing the trends would not suggest a huge effect. And often, casual empirical evidence is pretty strong stuff. When I start doing a more fancy model that deals with some of these time series problems of autocorrelation, the evidence is weak to non-existence, those little red areas of coefficients showing weak significance. There are a few isolated effects, but they just vanish over time. So this is another approach. So the first one was taking a probability model and going, what's the probability this is really going to have the benefits that were touted for that Proposition 65. Number two, the empirical strategy is, well, let me look at the data, and it's an empirical story. And the empirical story suggests little to no effect. I'm not claiming this is the end to any of this, but I would like to see somebody come along and do more empirical work and prove this wrong if it's true. But it's telling, as I say, why haven't there been studies done on this that are attempting to show other than just trust us? So now on to the cost. And my original paper went through a lot of this. I'm going to keep it fairly brief. It's a problem measuring the cost because there's no one solution for businesses. It depends. So they've got to figure out, am I going to post a warning? Am I going to stop production? Am I going to reformulate? Am I going to just ignore the law? I got to put in all this research, legal costs, and the business person has a taste for risk involved. So do I like to gamble or not? So what would the cost be? So businesses predict customer reactions to the alternative actions that can be taken to try to figure out their optimal business strategy. So what does a warning do? Well, it might weaken demand unless consumers don't care about the signs, don't notice them. Maybe even think they're a good thing. I don't know. The reformulation weakens demand if it affects taste, coloring, whatever the product attributes are that matter. Firms may just withdraw the products. There are a lot of different probabilities or possibilities here. I don't know the answer. It depends on a business by business case. But ignoring Prop 65 can also be costly. Lawsuits damage reputation, could weaken demand, result in legal costs and penalties. So the costs are numerous, and it's very difficult to come up with a number. It's really on an individual business by business case. Now on to opportunistic plaintiff lawyers. Well, you think about this, well, it's done by acting in the public good. It is not a government agency. And you can collect portions of civil penalties up to $2,500 per day for each violation. So if we look at all the settlements I just took since 2011, and these are on the California website there by the Attorney General, it's a pretty large chunk of change, especially when you look at how much is going to the attorneys. And there's a very unclear connection of these dollars to public health, because this is how a settlement could take place. Yes, here's a settlement costing $80,000, and here's the solution. Here's your $80,000, and I now post a sign. Done. So what did that do for public health? Maybe, given kind of the early thinking on these sorts of things, you go, oh, public health magically improves, or not. So here we've set up a public policy that, as I got into this, was, wow, this is a pretty fascinating, challenging thing. The payments are also, in effect, profits, because there's no cost from litigation for the plaintiffs. The plaintiffs are entitled to cost reimbursement of bringing the lawsuit, oftentimes even if they lose. So the law burdens the businesses, though, to prove that the clinical exposure doesn't exceed the law. So then you've got to have a case-by-case analysis done. This stuff's pretty costly, at least I hear. So there are many costs that are imposed on the citizens. So I deal with public policy. I'm always trying to think of all the inadvertent policy effects, as well as the myriad of consumers, producers that are affected. So the hidden costs are very difficult to quantify. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Taxpayers pick up administrative costs and uncompensated court costs. California governments receive little of the settlement costs. Businesses bear testing and labeling costs. Businesses lose sales when you've got unhappy customers, reformulated products, withdrawn products, bad publicity. Consumers bear price hikes. So you come in and reformulate, or you get a big lawsuit after you. I mean, you got to raise the price. Workers suffer lower income, job insecurity. Governments receive less tax revenue from lost sales and fewer jobs. I'm sure there are others I've missed. How would I get a number on all these? So here are the costs. We talked about the benefits. So in conclusion, I teach public finance, public policy, and I couldn't help but give you this line. Costs without public health benefits are characteristics of very bad public policy. So what do we want to do? We want to improve public health. So we want to do a benefit cost analysis. And proposition, there isn't even a charade of a benefit cost analysis being done. So there are some other costs involved with doing this I'll talk about. So this probability model demonstrates kind of the fanciful nature of Prop 65. The way I'm looking at it is, this is what we call heroic policymaking. We're experimenting on citizens, but it's very unheroic too, in my mind, since there's little to no attempt to determine the effectiveness. The probability model, though, offers at least I'll use quote, scientific framework for modeling effects that maybe foster, and maybe this is a stretch, valiant policies that actually would improve public health. Wouldn't that be nice? So as an economist that works with scarcity all the time, what have we done? Well, we say, we already did that. We just passed this law. There's Prop 65. We are protecting Californians. And I'm thinking, well, show me this. Give me some evidence of this and that the benefits outweigh the costs. My concern is always that we could have done something much better, or we could reform this much better. There's a huge cost to public health for imposing a law like this that is very bad public policy. So now on to reforms. Number one, change the burden of proof so that the plaintiff has to incur the cost of proving exposures. So you can't just drive up to a restaurant and go, I notice you don't have any signs. You got 60 days. And before there were some amendments, we believed that many dollars were going under the table saying, just go away. Does that improve public health? I'm not convinced. So this is hopefully to decrease the number of low merit and frivolous lawsuits that do not, at least from the evidence that I see, has improved public health much. Number two, help citizens focus on high probability risks, not shark attacks, especially for those that don't go out into the water. So how would you redesign to roughly assess true risk? Well, remember this bar has been a warning of a 0.001% chance of contracting cancer over 70 years. That's a fairly low bar. In comparison, from recent work that's been done by Viscusi and Jeckhauser and Robinson. The cancer risk of smoking is about 10,000 times greater than that. Now, that's a risk that probably, most likely, is fairly effective at doing what it's attempting to do, improve public health. So the current change in the warnings, I'm not convinced are particularly that great. And finally, and doing a lot of work for the Mercatus Center, where I was doing a lot of regulatory review, hardly anything ever, once it's passed, has a retrospective review. Did it work? Could we reform it? Prop 65 is over 30 years old. Has it accomplished its goals? Well, if you look on the website of the California government, of course it has. And I keep looking, show me the study that you have that shows this, other than it's a promise. So what reforms would you do? And then my concern as an economist is dealt with looking at public health interventions by economists. When you don't have the interventions work, often the economists and policymakers say, well, the problem is the hammer isn't heavy enough. We need to ramp it up. So here's the problem. If you're ramping up a flawed policy, I'm pretty sure public health is going to continue to suffer. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Very much. It's fascinating, and I think the admonition here about doing these mass experiments on the public without having some follow-up to determine what the effect of those were, in this case on public health, it's eye-opening, and I hope others are listening to what you're saying and trying to follow some of your lead in making these assessments. We do have time maybe for one question, if we have one from the floor. We have a question. Dr. Marlow will be here through at least a while.
For a couple hours.
Okay, and so you can certainly catch him. No questions at the moment? Yes. Hi. Sorry, we need to get you to a microphone.
Hi, Fiona Wallace, Nestle, Canada. Yeah, I was just wondering, you're obviously a professor who teaches to scientists and to a number of young people in your class that you mentioned. I was wondering what the feedback was from your students when you present this to them. You know, because you're increasingly hearing that millennials want more transparency and this is terribly important, and I'm just wondering what is the, what's the overall, I guess, tone or vibe in the class when this sort of lecture is given?
In truth, the smart ones understand this pretty well. But, you know, you have to come in, and for some reason, I guess I was born with working on contentious issues. And a lot of people want to believe that, oh, what's the harm, even if it doesn't, you know, work? And I'm going, the harm is huge about public health suffering because we should be doing something else. And I think that's a very difficult thing for people to figure out.
Yeah.
Because they think, oh, who cares? And in fact, if you go back to the nudge, and I've written on this aspect of it, they go, it doesn't matter. Nudges are voluntary in the sense you don't have to do anything. And I think that is really wrong-headed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, just I don't know. I've kind of been thinking through the nudge thing a lot lately. I recently lost my father to a long battle with heart disease, and despite being a medical doctor with a daughter and a PhD in nutrition who works in food labeling, you know, there was nothing that would have changed his mind about putting cream on his cereal, no matter what happened. And, you know, there's a lot of arguments these days about labels and nudging and this whole thing, and there's just some people it'll never work on. And
well, I think the whole issue of neuroscience, behavioral economics, is certainly a great innovation, but it doesn't necessarily mean we know how to devise policies that optimize on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yet.
Yeah, more research is needed, I think. But.
as long as it's not too much social experimentation here on that can harm people.
Right. Thank you very much.
Brent Kolbush with Cargill. Thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. It's funny, there's two things I'd like to say. One is I have an aunt and uncle who've lived in LA their whole life. My uncle runs a tile factory and they've never even heard of Prop 65, so I can relate there every time I talk to them about what I do and stuff. The other thing too is that you know, you may or may not be aware of, and selfishly speaking, I don't think there's a week that goes by I don't get a Prop 65 type email at work or on a call concerning Prop 65 about a new chemical or whatnot and what the strategy is. And so I know it's more of a qualitative effort, but it definitely affects the cost of managing through this particular law within the food industry. There's significant, not just the labels or whether or not, but managing each and every proposed chemical that may come aboard, because you know they have a bottom line just like any of us, and if they stop identifying chemicals, their bottom line goes away. So they continually get more and more ridiculous. I think they've gotten out of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of chemicals, and now they're into more grabbing at things. And it just, that's part of the cost analysis, and the economics behind it is just the amount of hours and time spent by many of us in this room to try and manage not only the label, but the supply chain implications, and these types of things. So just something to contribute to the analysis and the cost needed to manage through these things. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you much.
Okay, again, thank you very much, Dr. Marlow. Help me thank him. Excellent, excellent presentation.